Welcome to our panel on AIs and supply chains, or maybe definitely not supply chains in the AI context. I'm joined today by David Gray Widder of Carnegie Mellon and Catherine Stihler of Creative Commons. And we're going to talk about how first data and then software are assembled to make the AIs that have been grabbing so many headlines in the news today. Why not first start with a brief introduction and how each of you got involved in this? David, why don't we start with you?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for great to be here. Nice to meet you, Catherine. So yeah, my name's David. I am a final month of my PhD at Carnegie Mellon. I know, trying to write my dissertation, but my PhD is really trying to understand AI ethics and ethical AI from the perspective of developers, people building parts of AIs, parts of AI systems. And in doing this work, what I've realized is that developers feel a lot of more responsibility, I should say, for building their part well and ensuring that, if you're building a model, it doesn't, introduce bias, or if you're tuning a model, that you're not tuning it in a way that introduces bias, for example.
Yeah.
But what my research has sort of shown, especially with some of my more recent work, is that we have to think of this as a supply chain problem, because and one of the reasons I'm so grateful to be here with Catherine is a lot of developers will be like, oh, we just got the data off the web. That's not our sort of module. That's not our thing, our concern. Or this is a pre-approved data set assembled from a massive scrape of and therefore, because it's a standard data set we got off the shelf, it's not ours. So the supply chain metaphor, I think, is really helpful, at least in my context, for helping people building AI see the links they have to their upstream dependencies and their downstream uses, and understand that ethics doesn't stop once you put something online or once you build the thing and give it away. You have to think about who's going to use it for what. You have to think what you're depending on, what kind of data you're depending on, what kind of models you're depending on, and so that's what I'm excited to talk about and learn as well from both of you as well. So. Yeah, great to be here.
That's really cool. Welcome. Catherine, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So great to meet you, David, and I'm so excited about this conversation. So my name is Catherine Stihler. I'm the CEO of Creative Commons. I got involved in the open world through working in a piece of legislative work that when I was a member of the European Parliament on copyright reform, and it was through that. But it was interesting because when we were working on that, we were talking a lot about machine learning. AI was something that was out there, but not something that was central. And now in reflection, I think that perhaps within that, we should have been far more astute. We now see that the EU is producing an AI Act, and that is going through the legislative process as we speak. Probably one of the first big pieces of regulation that will affect AI. So very interested in that. So open for me was about not just about accountability and transparency, but about this commons of learning, of knowledge, that all creativity is built on other creativity, all knowledge is built on other knowledge. And how do we ensure that the commons is not lost when we're talking about some of these things? So when you talked about supply chain, David, it's really interesting because we've never thought about it in that kind of metaphor, like how is this a supply chain issue? And when you start to think about it, and it's something that we do need to consider and reflect on. Supply chain has got many other iterations. It doesn't really sit in a commons narrative, and so that is a challenge. How do we reconcile some of these issues? And I think now is the time to have that conversation, because as we start to look at the regulatory environment, as we start to look at how. You talked about data. I mean, you're only as good as the data that you have, and how do you make sure that the data is used in training and that the models that are created are. I keep thinking there's so much about the human intervention and the choices that are made. It's not just some random AI doing some. It's humans at the center of this, and so how do we think about that, and how do we educate folks that are going to be faced both in their personal life and professional lives about how some of this stuff is going to affect them? So I think it's a very interesting conversation to have, and I'm really, really grateful to be here. So thanks, Lewis.
Oh yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation. I mean, I think Catherine, you hit on so much that's important there. a recurring but unintentional theme of some of the talks today is about this regulatory question,
Yes.
where I think I had tended before this, I had tended to think about supply chains as sort of an industrial or commercial concept. And it's very clear, and I think hopefully we'll talk about a little bit more in this conversation, that supply chains exist in part because of regulation to satisfy regulatory needs as much as to satisfy commercial needs. And I think that's been a very interesting learning for me from this. David, I want to get back to you. Let's talk a little bit more. You literally titled a recent paper of yours, Thinking Upstream, which was a lovely coincidence when I discovered that. You talked a little bit about this supply chain metaphor and why it's so important in AI, including a few like key bullet points about why this metaphor is important. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely, and love it when there's a nice coincidence in what in naming there. Yeah, so again, like when people are building things, people they focus on the thing they're building and not sort of the inputs and downstream effects. So the supply chain metaphor, I mean, is nothing new. I mean, as you recognize, it comes from more, it's been used in sort of industrial supply chain notions. And we lead the paper actually pointing out that Nike used to disavow its upstream supply chain as not its problem when, child labor concerns were brought up. And we see a similar move happening in some AI companies. OpenAI recently saying that, the data labelers or the people that are filtering traumatic information or data from our model are not a problem, even though they're underpaid because we outsource that. So helping situate sort of the work of each sort of step of the AI supply chain within a broader context helps us think a little bit more holistically, carefully, widen the scope of how we think about ethics. And so upstream, I mean, as I wrote in this sort of Thinking Upstream paper, we're just trying, this is a very short 2-page paper, trying to provoke thinking about how we might act on ethics up the AI supply chain, because we're trying to recognize the fact that right now, oftentimes ethics is thought of as like the last link in the chain problem. The person who finally releases the app to the public is the one who is on the hook if there's if there's bias, if the chatbot ends up saying racist things. But we want to examine opportunities for agency up the chain. How can we make it so it doesn't fall down onto the last person, the last link in the chain, so to speak, and better distribute that sense of ethical responsibility? So a few different mechanisms that I'm not an expert in, but I think are worthy of exploring are thinking about human rights law, thinking about how human rights law can be used as a mechanism to think about what responsibilities exist up the chain. Draw an analogy to how existing human rights law applies in a physical goods context. And then market-based interventions, sort of, if you're buying or in a position to be a choosy customer, can you say, hey, we would love to use your model, but we need more disclosures and we need more information. We need more assurance that the way you've built this thing is using properly consented data, using data where people knew that they were going to be volunteering their data for this, and sort of using that customer position to ask for more action up the supply chain. And then there's also, more activist approaches. There's, activist-oriented audits, sort of examining, issues up that chain. And there's also ethical licensing. There's like, saying this is an open source thing. You can use this for anything that doesn't, contravene these ethical boundaries. Now, I'm not a lawyer, and there's issues about enforceability there, I know for sure. But I think that does at least, sort of lead into the conversation that I'm really excited here, which is how are people who create data or algorithms that feed into sort of this broad public commons aware of what their stuff is being used for? And as technology changes, to use it for all kinds of new different things, like do the expectations change? Do they feel okay with how those changes, how their stuff is being used when it is in sort of the public arena?
I think that's a great transition point because, David, your work is in some way, I mean, you're in the computer science department, but your work is in some sense very anthropological. One of the things that I loved about your paper, or one of the papers that we've mentioned here, is that you sat down and interviewed developers who are actually building these tools, right? It's not a theory-based thing. You're actually sitting and talking with them. And Catherine, Creative Commons is very much engaged in a talking and interviewing kind of thing right now, right?
There was a big microphone thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hopefully we can make that. But if not, okay, yeah. And so, Catherine, I mean, CC is talking with a lot of people about AI, how they feel about AI. Can you tell us a little bit about what CC has learned so far and what you still hope to learn?
I think there's so many points there, Lewis. I'll try and distill it. I mean, I think that certainly the creators we're speaking to, there are kind of three areas around consent, credit, and compensation that seems to be a common theme. And so we're reflecting on what does that mean. There are debates around licenses, and that's for sure. I think where we're landing is that a lot of what people want copyright to solve isn't a copyright question. And so how do we try and navigate that with new norms and new practices? And I think that's something where that's a common theme that seems to be coming back. Something I wanted to add to what David said about responsibility and accountability and about what you're seeing about supply chains, David, it really resonates with some of the work that I used to do on fair trade, on how do you look at how that supply chain. I think there are models there that we should be looking at, and also practices. And fair trade just keeps coming back to me for what you were saying, because it was something that took 20, 30 years to develop. But actually, what you're looking at are practices and norms now that have been adopted, and an accountability for that along that whole chain. Now, what Lewis, you were saying about how people before, in a kind of with a commons approach, perhaps created content that's now being used in ways that was not intended for. That is something that's why Creative Commons in their new strategic direction thought very intentionally about our ideas around better sharing rather than sharing for sharing's sake. How can we look at that? And that does bring a more ethical lens to some things. I think when you go down, the route that you were talking about, David, as well, you've got to be very thoughtful and intentional. And some of the things that we've been observing that were practiced 20 years ago are not the practices of what we need for today. So I think the three C's of consent, credit, and compensation, I think, Lewis, have been certainly in our deliberations and conversations, our roundtables and events that we've been holding over the past 4 months. That is the kind of key theme. Now, how do we do that well is the big question, right? I mean, how do we test things? How do we look at what is needed, but be very intentional about that? And now, so we're kind of coming through that process with some thoughts and ideas that we'll be sharing as we progress over the months to come. But the issues around consent, credit, and compensation are the key themes that we've been observing.
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. I think one thing that I'm sort of hearing almost in the background of what both of you are saying is that we are moving from a world where, I mean, I published things on Flickr literally 20 years ago now under CC licenses, 15 years ago now under CC licenses, and I did not think of a way in which I would be made less if other people used it, right? I mean, the classic Jefferson quote that CC used a lot in early stuff was, if you light your candle at my candle, it does not make my light any less bright. But it seems that we are in a situation now where a lot of people are concerned about actually, if you use my photo of my face to train facial recognition software, or, you know, David, if we use stuff that I conceived of for scientific computing that's now being used for all kinds of surveillance, people see themselves as being lessened by this sharing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
To you both?
I think it does, Lewis, and I think that's why we landed on, and we're very intentional about better sharing as our key strategic theme in terms of what's pro-social, what's ethical, how do we look at the now? That's a very new thoughtfulness of going some direction about how do we share better. Now, you know, how do we get that balance between making sure that that creativity and knowledge is out there, but also doing it in a way which sits well with our values? And I think that was one of the key tensions that you see, is that how do we have these values, a commons value of sharing, but also the values that we want to see about public interest, public goods, you know? And I think that's somewhere where that kind of commons conversation, and we're hoping, we've got our summit coming up in October, where we will have an AI and commons theme. I'm also conscious that a lot of the conversations around this are certainly in the global north and not inclusive of other voices, and we need to be cognizant of that. And hopefully when we gather in Mexico City at the beginning of the 3rd to 6th of October, and anyone that's listening to this, please come and join us in that conversation, because it's really important that at this moment we have that opportunity to have these conversations. And David, it'd be great to have you there if you can make it, because I think what you're doing is so important and so interesting. But we are in a different world than we were 20 years ago, and the pace of change that we're experiencing today is going to mean that the things that we are going to, the new challenges that we're going to face, are going to be even greater and more present. So I think there's a lot that we can do, certainly from a Creative Commons perspective, in terms of norms and practices, of convening, of thoughtfulness, and that kind of global aspect to this, which is that we're all in this together. And whilst the EU might be regulating AI and the US is doing something else, and, you know, while we're thinking about this, the global aspect of this is really important in terms of that norms and practices that we want to share.
I want to put a pin in that global thing, but I want to ask, because I do think that's really an important observation, but I also want to come back to something that you said about the tension of doing this in a better way with some of the practices and habits that we've had over the years. You spoke particularly of values, but David, you talk in your work about the idea about modularity, about encapsulation. These are things that engineers, we really want, like nice, clearly defined values. Not it didn't start as a way to shirk our ethical responsibilities. It started as good engineering practice, but it turns out it sort of does both, right? Can you expand on that?
Absolutely. I mean, so for those who, I mean, I'm hopefully going to earn my PhD in software engineering. So very much from the sort of beginning from the technical, moving towards the sort of wider epistemic and social questions. And we're taught modularity as sort of a technical practice. It's this is the way you build your code so that you know what is going on inside the box, and you make sure it works, and you provide interfaces to people to use it outside the box. And they don't actually need to know what's going on inside the box. They just need to know how to use your code. And that is what allows, they just need to know how to use those interfaces, pardon me. And that's sort of what allows large software systems to be created, because it manages complexity, it divides labor, it sort of allows this sort of supply chain to exist. You can think of it as sort of the container, on container ships, right? In the physical supply chain analogy. But when that sort of technical practice, and what we kind of argue in the paper, that has filtered from or transcended from a technical practice to sort of being more of an epistemic, the good way of thinking, the good way of building things. I'm responsible for my module. I make it easy, I expose certain ways of using it for other people to build on, and then I'm not accountable for how it's then used. And that's what I'm a little concerned about. And in fact, I think this links to some questions I actually had for Catherine based on what she's talking about, if that's cool. And just sort of elaborating what you said is, I'm also thinking a lot about sort of corporate power in the commons,
Yeah.
and corporate power
Yeah.
in the supply chain as well, because I mean, we might be familiar with, we are probably all familiar with GPT-4, and may be familiar with the Sparks of AGI paper, which is sort of a little bit notorious in my field, which is where they argued that there are sparks of artificial general intelligence emanating from GPT-4. And I hold that claim as dubious at best. But these people who are sort of the first to have access to this large new model and had a business relationship with its creators, OpenAI, said that we have to assume it's seen every potential benchmark. We have to assume it has basically has the entire internet in its training set. So we're not even going to question what's in it. We can't sort of dig inside. And I think that's sort of a strange if we're just going to accept that the whole internet is going to be used to train AI, and also then that lets us disavow a careful curation of what then ends up in our model. Yes. And the other thing I wanted to say, building on Catherine's point, is, I just licensed one of my right before this call, I licensed one of my new papers using a CC logo. It has a nice CC logo on it, and I'm a big believer in this, at the same time, with new ways of new artificial intelligence tools, it's not the same equitable playing field for everyone to make use of what's in the commons, right? Because if I wanted to build GPT-4, I can't. I don't have the compute. I don't have the massive data set. There's no way. So there's really only like 3 or 4 players in the world, corporate players in the world, who can use the Creative Commons, the commons broadly in the generative AI sense, because they have the scale to do so. So I'm like, wow, like I really, really want, people to be able to use my artwork, which is my night job. It makes me the big bucks, not a PhD stipend. Just kidding. And also, I really want other academics and really anyone to be able to read my papers and and quote them and be influenced by them and critique them too. But then once that then is data that really only a few corporate players can really build generative AI based on, that's where I get a little concerned. So I'm just curious, how does corporate power filter into this?
I think that's a really important question, probably a key question, because if we want to, and I think this maybe where we need to define what we see as public interest, public good. And I don't think that's happening at the moment. I really don't. I think there's a whole gap out there about how do you define a commons value in the age of AI. That's why the theme of Summit is going to be really important about AI and the commons and AI. But I think what you are touching upon is really fundamental, because if you are building on something that's open and extracting value out of that, how do you give back? And I think these alliances of digital public goods and thinking about public interest, but who funds this? And this is where it's really, again, it's a global issue because we benefit from this. So how do we go back to intention? What are the ideas, the concepts to really invest? And I say this in a commons that benefits us all, because this power imbalance, as you describe, we've seen part of that happen in the past 20 years, and look where it's got us. So what about the next 20 years? And thinking about in an age of generative AI. I don't have the solutions. I've only got questions.
Me either.
and if I said I had the solutions, I would be lying to you. It's like at the moment, we were a board member at Creative Commons challenged us to say, imagine the commons. What would good look like? How can we have that narrative? Because at the moment, the narrative feels very much one-sided about, more about harms than about good. There's just And I think the whole tech narrative just now is very much on the negative rather than what could good look like. And if we can articulate a vision for the commons of values that we share that's centered in public interest and public good, that can be a vision for us and about what we want to see. But if we don't articulate that now, we're going to be missing an opportunity which could drive something. So I think that, you know, there's a challenge, but there's also an opportunity for us. And I think Creative Commons is well set to kind of try and create that. But at the same point, the train is leaving the station.
Yeah.
The narrative is going in a perhaps a different direction than where we need it to go, which is a narrative, I think, of again, going back to public interest, public good, I think we have to center it in that way. And at the moment, I'm not even sure the EU AI Act is really doing that effectively, because how they're regulating it is around a system of what has happened before about goods. And I think AI is very different from regulating a toy product or regulating, you know, it's a different beast, which needs new ways of thinking and new ideas. So I'll stop there, Lewis. There's lots.
No, I mean,
this is all great. I think one of the things here, and I'm curious what you both think about this, and it might actually be a good note to end on. You don't have to rush your answers. I think the answers might go on for a while. You know, I mean, David, you spoke about these sort of black boxes, and I think in some senses the copyright licenses were simple, clearly defined answers to these questions, right? You can do this, you can't do that. The can'ts are very simple.
Yeah.
And you were entering, I think, Catherine, as you're putting very eloquently, a more fluid time, right? Where norms that are hard to articulate, that are hard to, I mean, if you ask a lawyer to write down, please define the public interest in a copyright license. I can't help you with that,
Lewis.
Right? Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's fine.
You're a lawyer.
Yeah. You know, I mean, that's an impossible drafting challenge, because the notion is so big and so broad, and it makes it hard to answer some of these questions at other levels of the supply chain, right? If we start talking about norms and compensation, people up I mean, David, to your point about corporate concentration, as soon as you start making things vague at lower levels, you start making things nearly impossible at higher levels, which I have spoken to people in this space who that is actually their goal, right? They want to make it vague so that it will be impossible. I would hope that there's some kind of middle ground, but I don't know what it is, and I don't know if either of you have insights from, you know, in terms of how do we navigate this tricky thing where I don't think either of you want to blow up progress in AI as it's currently understood.
That's right.
But how do we make that better while still preserving something, right?
Yeah. I can start off if that's all right. So, I mean, again, like, great question, Lewis, and building on what you just said, Catherine. I think for me, on my little sticky note, it comes down to like agency and choice, and also norms. And thinking back to you know, the interactions I've had licensing some of my own content under Creative Commons, I can choose. I can make choices about, like, you know, is this a non-commercial option? Is this a you know, share alike or not? You know, and all that. And I think that this, you know, actually just right now, reflecting that kind of choice back in my own work and my own research, I study how developers want more agency and want more control over the downstream impact, in some cases, the downstream impact of their code, but they don't really have that right now, because a little bit it's seen as either it's fully open or it's fully closed, and neither one of those serve what they want to do. So I think that, like, and then that leads me to norms. And what I'm really excited about with, you know, bodies such as the Creative Commons and their power to play in this conversation is to provide sort of norms that allow more choices to creators. to define maybe what, I built this new piece of code. I'm more familiar with code than I am in sort of artistic licensing and such. That's what I focus on. People are like, oh, I created this piece of code, and I want it to be usable by anyone, but maybe not for commercial use, or maybe not for military use, maybe not for I don't know. But there's a lot of views on, and I think, Catherine, you mentioned it's hard to agree on what good is, and I think that the power here is that maybe we can have a pluralistic idea that allows people to choose what they think is good for it. They want their thing to be used for, and therefore provide more agency back to the creators. And that's where, with norms, we can move from, I'm not a lawyer, and so I don't put all my eggs in the legal basket. And some of my work shows the power of norms. So even if something, you can take something that's Creative Commons non-commercial and then build it into a model that you then sell and no one will know. But you can at least set norms that have some power, even if they don't have the full force of law. And I think that's where I'm excited to explore, and certainly not an expert, but would be excited to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. And I think that point on norms is just so important, because legal tools are legal tools, and there's a limit to what they can do. I think the norms aspect, and that's the theme that that keeps coming back, is just where, and we've got some time to be thoughtful, to be curious, and to really dig deeply into what that could look like. But I think we need to share a vision, and that goes back to what you're saying about artists and creators, about the consent, the credit, the compensation aspect of how, and the other C is choice, right? And I think that's a really, the choice aspect is important, so that people are empowered and enabled and can be and have that choice that is theirs. And I also think that the issue around responsibility, accountability, transparency is also important in this space. And as we move forward about how AI can be held how the responsibility, the accountability aspects should be more front and center, than just saying it's a closed box and it's too dangerous and you can't know about this, when actually so much of it is human choices and human beings that are part of this. So,
and that's where openness can really help. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, openness and human community, right?
Yeah.
I flashed briefly on the bottom of the screen, David, a paper we won't have time to discuss much today because we are going to wrap it. But I think what a great note to tie both of your work together, right? Because David, you've written about how humans can sort of work around the license to create norms in their communities. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about, Catherine, right? Like, how do we create human norms that are flexible, that are literally humane? And I think that is totally in line with what CC is talking about with better sharing. So I'm so excited to have been able to bring you two together. Thank you so much for sharing with our audience today. This was a lot of fun. And, thank you again for coming.
Thank you. Thanks, Lewis.
Great to be here.
Great to be here.